Karen had always been the kind of person who lived for adventure. Whether it was skydiving over the Swiss Alps, snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters of the Maldives, or simply wandering through a bustling market in Marrakech, she thrived on new experiences. Her friends often joked that Karen could turn even the most mundane outing into an exciting escapade. So when she decided to visit London during her summer vacation, everyone knew it wouldn't be just another ordinary trip. London was everything Karen imagined it would be: historic, vibrant, and full of surprises. From the towering Big Ben to the serene beauty of Hyde Park, every corner seemed to whisper stories of the past. But there was one place Karen couldn't wait to see: Buckingham Palace. As home to the British monarchy, it symbolized tradition, elegance, and power. And today, she finally stood outside its gates, camera in hand, ready to soak it all in. The palace courtyard buzzed with activity. Tourists from around the world gathered, their faces lighting up as they snapped photos and marveled at the grandeur of the building. Some were dressed casually, while others wore outfits fit for royalty themselves. Families posed for pictures near the Golden Gates, couples strolled arm in arm, and children giggled as they pointed at the guards standing tall and motionless nearby. It felt like stepping into a postcard. Karen joined the crowd, her excitement growing as she approached the famous changing of the guard ceremony. She'd heard so much about it: the precision, the pageantry, the music, and now she was here to witness it firsthand. The band began to play, filling the air with lively tunes that made people clap along. Soldiers marched in perfect formation, their red uniforms and bearskin hats making them look larger than life. Every movement was calculated, every step synchronized. It was mesmerizing. As the ceremony unfolded, Karen found herself drawn to one particular guard. He stood apart from the rest, stationed near the edge of the courtyard. His posture was impeccable, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he stared straight ahead, unmoving. To Karen, he looked almost statue-like, blending seamlessly into the backdrop of history and tradition. She tilted her head, studying him curiously. How did he manage to stay so still? Did he get bored? Was he even human? Her curiosity soon gave way to mischief. Karen had always been someone who liked to push boundaries, not out of malice, but because she enjoyed seeing how far she could go before things got interesting. Today, surrounded by strangers and caught up in the moment, she felt bolder than usual. An idea popped into her head, one that made her grin despite herself. What if she could make this stoic guard crack? Just a little. She glanced around, noticing how other tourists interacted with the guards. Some waved or tried to catch their attention, only to be ignored completely. Others laughed at their unresponsiveness, treating them more like props than people. That's when it hit her. These rifles they carried didn't seem real. They looked too polished, too decorative. Surely they weren't loaded, right? Maybe they were just part of the show, meant to add drama to the spectacle. Without giving it much thought, Karen edged closer to the guard, her heart racing with anticipation. She told herself it was harmless fun, something to laugh about later with her friends back home. After all, what was the worst that could happen? Karen's mind raced as she took one last glance around to make sure no one was paying too much attention to her. The crowd was still focused on the ceremony, snapping photos and chatting excitedly. She felt invisible, like just another face in the sea of tourists. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer to the guard, her sneakers scuffing softly against the pavement. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if she should really go through with it. But then she shook off the doubt. It was just a joke after all, something silly that would give her a funny story to tell later. With a deep breath, Karen reached out and grabbed the rifle from the guard's shoulder. It happened so fast that even she was surprised by her own boldness. The weapon felt heavier than she expected, its cold metal surface pressing into her hands. For a split second, everything seemed frozen in time. The band continued playing, the other guards marched in perfect rhythm, and the tourists nearby carried on, as if nothing unusual had happened. Karen held the rifle up awkwardly, pretending to pose for an imaginary photo. A nervous laugh escaped her lips as she turned toward a group of people nearby, hoping they'd find her antics amusing. But the reaction wasn't what she anticipated. Instead of laughter or cheers, there were gasps. Someone muttered, "Oh my God," under their breath, while another person whispered urgently, "Put it down." The once lively atmosphere turned tense, almost suffocating. Karen's smile faltered as she realized something was wrong. Very wrong. The guard she'd taken the rifle from didn't move at first, his expression unreadable behind his stoic demeanor. Then, without warning, he sprang into action. His voice boomed across the courtyard, sharp and commanding. "Step back. Do not move." The words echoed like thunder, cutting through the music and chatter. Tourists froze in place, unsure of what to do. Parents pulled their children close, shielding them instinctively. Even the marching soldiers paused mid-step, their heads snapping toward the commotion. Within seconds, 2 more guards rushed over, their rifles now pointed directly at Karen. Their faces were hard, their eyes locked onto her like lasers. Panic bubbled up inside Karen as she dropped the rifle immediately, letting it clatter to the ground. She raised her hands high above her head, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The guards weren't interested in explanations. They were trained professionals following protocol. And right now, that protocol involved treating this situation as a potential threat. More shouts rang out as additional guards joined the scene, forming a tight circle around Karen. One of them barked orders into a radio clipped to his uniform, his tone urgent. Moments later, armed police officers appeared, moving swiftly through the crowd. They wore bulletproof vests and carried weapons that looked far more intimidating than the decorative rifle Karen had picked up. The sight of them sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her body. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just supposed to be a harmless prank, a stupid, harmless prank. The tourists who had been laughing moments ago now stared in stunned silence, some filming the chaos on their phones. A few backed away cautiously, while others stayed rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what Karen had done and why the response was so extreme. "Do you think she knew it was real?" one woman asked nervously. "She's going to be in so much trouble," replied a man standing next to her. Karen wanted to disappear. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, and tears welled up in her eyes as the gravity of the situation hit her. She hadn't meant to cause any harm. She hadn't even thought about the consequences. To her, the rifle had seemed like part of the show, a prop meant to enhance the grandeur of the ceremony. But now, surrounded by armed officers and stern-faced guards, she understood how serious her actions truly were. This wasn't a game anymore. It was real life, and she was in deep trouble. As the police began questioning her, Karen's mind raced. How had things escalated so quickly? What would happen to her now? Would she get arrested? Fined? Deported? The questions swirled in her head, each one more terrifying than the last. All she could do was stand there, hands raised, as the world she thought she knew crumbled around her. The moment Karen dropped the rifle, time seemed to slow down. The heavy weapon clattered against the ground with a metallic clang that echoed through the courtyard, drawing even more attention to the unfolding chaos. Her hands trembled as she held them high above her head, palms open in a gesture of surrender. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The once calm atmosphere of Buckingham Palace had transformed into something out of a movie scene, complete with shouting guards, panicked tourists, and armed police officers closing in. Karen's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She glanced around desperately, searching for a friendly face or someone who might tell her this was all just a misunderstanding. Instead, she saw fear etched on the faces of the people around her. Parents shielded their children, pulling them away from the commotion. Some tourists backed up slowly, while others stood frozen, phones in hand, recording every second of the drama. It dawned on Karen that she wasn't just making a fool of herself, she was causing real panic. People thought they were in danger. The commanding officer barked orders, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Secure the area. No one moves," he shouted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Guards formed a tight perimeter around Karen, their rifles now raised and ready. Their expressions were unreadable behind their stoic facades, but their body language spoke volumes. They were prepared for anything. To Karen, they looked less like ceremonial figures and more like soldiers ready for battle. This wasn't the playful display she'd imagined. This was serious business. Within moments, armed police officers arrived, moving with precision and purpose. They wore tactical gear, their vests emblazoned with official insignias, and carried weapons that looked far more menacing than the decorative rifle Karen had touched. As they approached, she felt her knees weaken. One officer stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, lower your hands slowly and stay still." His words sent chills down her spine. Lowering her arms felt like admitting defeat, but she obeyed, dropping them to her sides like lead weights. The crowd murmured nervously, some whispering theories about what Karen had done wrong. "Do you think she's dangerous?" one woman asked her companion. "Why else would they bring in the police?" another replied. Karen wanted to scream that she wasn't dangerous, that she was just a silly tourist who hadn't thought things through. But she knew better than to speak. Anything she said could make things worse, so she stood there silently, tears streaming down her face as the reality of her situation sank in. As the officers began questioning her, the questions came fast and sharp. "What is your name? Where are you from? Why did you take the rifle?" Each word felt like a punch to the gut. Karen stammered through her answers, her voice cracking under the pressure. I didn't mean anything by it," she managed to say between sobs. "I thought it was fake. I didn't know." But her explanations sounded weak, even to her own ears. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow restless. Some tourists began to disperse, eager to put distance between themselves and the unfolding drama. Others lingered, unable to tear their eyes away. Phones flashed as videos were recorded and uploaded to social media platforms in real time. By the time Karen was led away, handcuffed and humiliated, the incident had already begun spreading online. Hashtags like #BookingImpalaceIncident and #TouristTrouble started trending, turning what should have been a private mistake into a very public spectacle. As Karen was escorted toward a waiting police vehicle, she caught glimpses of the faces around her. Most were blank with shock, but a few glared at her with undisguised anger. One elderly man shook his head in disgust, muttering something about respect and tradition. A young mother clutched her child tightly, glaring at Karen as if she were personally responsible for ruining their day. Even the guards, who had returned to their posts after securing the area, avoided looking at her altogether. Their silence spoke louder than any words. They were professionals doing their job, and Karen had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. Inside the police car, Karen finally allowed herself to break down completely. Sobs racked her body as she replayed the events in her mind over and over again. What had started as a harmless prank, a stupid, thoughtless joke, had spiraled into something far beyond her control. She couldn't believe how quickly everything had fallen apart. One careless decision had turned her dream vacation into a nightmare, and now she faced consequences she couldn't even begin to imagine. All she could do was sit there. The sterile, fluorescent-lit room at Scotland Yard felt like a world away from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Karen sat slumped in a hard plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. The air was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of cleaning products that did little to mask the tension in the room. Across from her, two detectives sat at a metal table, their expressions unreadable but undeniably serious. One flipped through a notepad, while the other tapped a pen rhythmically against the surface, the sound echoing ominously in the silence. Karen's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Just hours ago, she'd been an ordinary tourist snapping photos and marveling at the changing of the guard ceremony. Now she was sitting in a police interrogation room, accused of something far more serious than she ever could have imagined. Her throat felt dry, and every time she swallowed, it seemed to take enormous effort. She wanted to explain herself, to make them understand that this whole thing had been a misunderstanding, a stupid, harmless prank, but the words stuck in her throat. The first detective leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Let's start from the beginning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you take the rifle?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was no warmth either. It was clear he wasn't interested in excuses or justifications, only facts. Karen hesitated, unsure where to begin. I didn't mean any harm," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was fake, like part of the show. I didn't realize." Her voice trailed off as tears welled up in her eyes again. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by how weak she must seem. But the truth was, she hadn't realized. In her mind, the rifle had been nothing more than a prop, meant to add drama to the ceremony. She hadn't stopped to think about the implications of grabbing it, or the potential danger it represented. The second detective sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Miss Karen," he said, using her name for emphasis, "do you understand the significance of what you did? These guards are here to protect the royal family and the public. Their weapons are real, and they're trained to respond to threats immediately. When you took that rifle, you put yourself, and everyone around you, at risk." Karen nodded frantically, her heart sinking further with each word. Of course, she understood now, or at least, she was starting to. But understanding didn't undo what had already happened. "I know I messed up," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I didn't think it through. I swear I never meant to cause trouble. It was just dumb." She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. The detectives exchanged a glance before continuing their questioning. They asked about her background, her intentions, and whether she had any connection to groups or individuals who might pose a threat to national security. At first, Karen was confused. Why would they think she was involved in something like that? But then it hit her. In today's world, even seemingly harmless actions could be interpreted as dangerous. Her careless decision had triggered protocols designed to prevent terrorism and protect the monarchy. No wonder the response had been so extreme. As the hours dragged on, Karen learned more about the gravity of her actions. The detectives explained that tampering with a royal guard's equipment wasn't just disrespectful, it was considered a criminal offense. Given recent threats to the royal family and high-profile incidents involving tourists behaving recklessly near protected sites, authorities weren't taking chances. Every detail of the incident would be scrutinized, and Karen's motives would be analyzed thoroughly before any decisions were made. Despite her growing anxiety, Karen couldn't help but notice how professional the detectives were. They weren't yelling or intimidating her. Instead, they were methodical, asking pointed questions and giving her space to answer. Still, the weight of the situation pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. By the time the interrogation ended, Karen felt emotionally drained. She was escorted to a holding cell, where she spent the night alone with her thoughts. Lying on the thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling, Karen replayed the day's events over and over in her mind. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? What would happen to her now? Would she go to jail, lose her job, be banned from traveling? Each possibility felt worse than the last. For the first time in her life, Karen truly understood the consequences of acting without thinking. As sleep finally claimed her, one thought lingered in her mind. She would never look at a harmless joke the same way again. By the time morning arrived, Karen's face was pale and drawn, her eyes bloodshot from a restless night spent tossing and turning on the hard cot in her holding cell. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind like a broken record. each memory sharper and more painful than the last. She had hoped that waking up would bring some clarity or relief, but instead, it only deepened her dread. Today was the day the world would find out what she had done. And find out they did. News of the Buckingham Palace incident spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Footage captured by tourists during the chaos had already gone viral, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by major news outlets worldwide. By breakfast time, hashtags like #Riflegate and #Karen at the Palace were trending globally. Clips of Karen grabbing the rifle, the guard's immediate reaction, and her tearful arrest dominated timelines everywhere. Comment sections exploded with opinions ranging from outrage to mockery, while memes mocking her actions began circulating almost instantly. Back home, Karen's family woke up to a barrage of notifications. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers bombarded them with messages asking if the woman in the videos was really their daughter, sister, or cousin. At first, they dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Surely, there must be some mistake. But as more details emerged, denial gave way to disbelief, then anger, and finally embarrassment. Her parents sat glued to the television, watching reporters dissect the incident frame by frame, their faces growing redder with each passing minute. "This isn't us," Karen's mother muttered under her breath, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "This isn't who we raised." Her father paced back and forth, his phone ringing non-stop with calls from concerned relatives and nosy neighbors. They felt blindsided, not just by Karen's actions, but by the overwhelming public scrutiny that came with it. Privacy was no longer an option. Their lives had become part of the story too. Meanwhile, Karen remained locked away, unaware of the full extent of the media frenzy, until a police officer brought her a newspaper during breakfast. The headline screamed at her in bold letters: "Tourist causes chaos at Buckingham Palace." Was it a joke gone wrong? Below it was a grainy photo of her mid-laugh, holding the rifle aloft like a trophy. Seeing herself immortalized in print made her stomach churn. She flipped through the pages, reading snippets of interviews with eyewitnesses who described her as reckless, disrespectful, and clueless. One quote stood out: "She acted like she didn't care about anyone else's safety." Karen dropped the paper onto the table, her appetite completely gone. For the first time, she realized how others saw her, not as a fun-loving traveler who'd made a dumb mistake, but as someone who had shown blatant disregard for tradition, security, and common sense. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. How could she have been so blind to the impact of her actions? As the hours passed, the pressure mounted. Reporters camped outside Scotland Yard, eager for updates on Karen's case. News anchors debated whether her behavior warranted leniency or punishment, often painting her as either a naive fool or a reckless troublemaker. Social media users joined in, their comments ranging from sympathetic, "Everyone makes mistakes," to scathing, "Ban her from ever coming back." Some even dug into her personal life, sharing old photos and posts from her accounts, dissecting every aspect of her personality, as if trying to understand what kind of person would do something so foolish. Amid the chaos, Karen's lawyer arrived to prepare her for what lay ahead. A kind-faced man in his 50s, he carried himself with quiet confidence, offering reassurance without sugarcoating the severity of the situation. "The court will consider your intentions," he explained gently, "but you need to take responsibility for your actions. Apologize sincerely, show remorse, and let them see that you've learned from this experience." Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered hoarsely. I wasn't thinking." Her lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly why we need to focus on showing growth. People make mistakes, Karen. What matters now is how you handle the aftermath." Later that evening, Karen's family managed to visit her briefly. Their expressions were a mix of frustration and concern, and the conversation was tense. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through?" her father demanded, his voice trembling with emotion. We're getting calls from everyone. Friends, coworkers, people we haven't heard from in years. Everyone knows our name because of this." Her mother, usually the calmer of the two, looked close to tears. "We love you, Karen, but you need to fix this. Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Karen nodded, guilt washing over her in waves. She hadn't considered how her actions would affect her loved ones. All she'd thought about was her own amusement in the moment. And now, the consequences were spilling over into every corner of her life. As the visit ended and her family left, Karen sat alone in her cell, staring at the wall. The weight of everything, the public shame, the legal trouble, the disappointment of those she cared about, felt unbearable. But somewhere deep inside, a small spark of determination flickered to life. If there was one thing she could control now, it was how she moved forward. And for the first time since the incident, Karen resolved to face the music, not just for herself, but for everyone whose lives she had touched. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Its walls were painted a dull beige, and the wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators eager to witness the outcome of Karen's case. Reporters filled the front rows, notebooks in hand, while cameras clicked softly outside the building. The air inside was heavy with anticipation, every whisper and shuffle magnified by the silence that hung over the room. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white from the pressure. She wore a plain black dress, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, an attempt to look as humble and remorseful as possible. As the judge entered the room, everyone stood up, including Karen, who felt her legs wobble beneath her. The judge took his seat, adjusting his glasses before glancing down at the stack of papers in front of him. His expression gave nothing away, no hint of sympathy or judgment. For Karen, this neutrality was almost worse than outright disapproval. At least anger would have been something she could understand. This cold impartiality left her feeling like a stranger in her own story. The prosecution began its argument first, painting Karen's actions as reckless and dangerous. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, standing tall and speaking with practiced authority, "this is not simply a matter of poor judgment. By removing a guard's rifle, a weapon designed for protection, Ms. Karen compromised not only the safety of those present, but also the integrity of one of our nation's most sacred traditions. In today's climate, where threats to public figures and institutions are ever present, such behavior cannot be dismissed lightly." He went on to describe the potential risks. What if someone else had followed Karen's lead? What if her actions had sparked panic among the crowd? What if the guards had been forced to escalate their response further? Each question landed like a hammer blow, driving home the seriousness of the situation. Karen flinched with every word, her stomach twisting into knots. She hadn't thought about any of these possibilities when she reached for the rifle. To her, it had seemed harmless. Now, hearing them laid out so clearly, she realized how naive she had been. When it was time for the defense to speak, Karen's lawyer rose slowly, his tone measured and calm. "Your Honor," he began, "my client acknowledges the gravity of her actions and deeply regrets the distress they caused. However, it is important to note that Ms. Karen did not act out of malice or ill intent. She believed, mistakenly, that the rifle was part of the ceremonial display and posed no real threat. This misunderstanding does not excuse her behavior, but it does provide context. Ms. Karen has expressed sincere remorse and is committed to making amends." Karen listened intently, nodding along as her lawyer spoke. When it came time for her to address the court, her heart raced. Standing up felt like stepping onto a stage without a script. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, looking directly at the judge, "I want to apologize to the guards, to the royal family, to everyone affected by my actions. I never meant to cause harm or disrespect. I acted impulsively and without thinking, and I take full responsibility for what happened. I've learned a painful lesson about the importance of respecting boundaries and considering the consequences of my choices. If given the chance, I promise to use this experience to grow and become a better person." Her words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but undeniably heartfelt. Some members of the audience exchanged glances, perhaps moved by her sincerity, while others remained stoic. The judge studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he announced that the court would deliberate before delivering a verdict. Hours later, the judge returned with his decision. He acknowledged Karen's lack of malicious intent, but emphasized the seriousness of her actions. While it is clear that Miss Karen did not pose an immediate threat, he said her behavior endangered public safety and undermined the dignity of a national institution. Such conduct cannot go unpunished. With that, he handed down the sentence. Karen would avoid jail time but was ordered to pay a substantial fine, complete 200 hours of community service, and attend mandatory counseling sessions focused on decision-making and accountability. Additionally, she was permanently banned from entering Buckingham Palace grounds. As the gavel struck the bench, signaling the end of the trial, Karen exhaled sharply, tears streaming down her face. Relief washed over her. She wouldn't be going to prison, but the weight of the penalties reminded her that forgiveness came at a cost. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at her, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. For once, Karen didn't try to hide. She stopped briefly, turning to face the crowd. "I'm truly sorry," she said, her voice steady despite her emotions. "I hope people can see that I've learned from this and will work hard to make things right." With that, she climbed into a waiting car, leaving behind the chaos she had created. As the vehicle pulled away, Karen stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the end. It was a chance to start over. Karen's life after the trial was far from normal. The media frenzy had died down slightly, but the stigma of being that tourist lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Back home, her days were filled with whispered conversations behind her back, sideways glances at the grocery store, and awkward silences when old friends tried to figure out what to say. Some people avoided her altogether, while others offered unsolicited advice or criticism. It was as if she'd become a walking cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly one bad decision could upend everything. At first, Karen struggled to adjust. She felt isolated, carrying the weight of shame everywhere she went. Her job, once a source of pride, became unbearable. Colleagues who had once laughed at her jokes now avoided eye contact in the hallway. Even small tasks, like grabbing coffee during her lunch break, felt monumental because she never knew who might recognize her. Every outing came with the fear of judgment, every interaction tinged with uncertainty. For weeks, she considered quitting her job and moving somewhere no one knew her name. But deep down, she knew running away wouldn't solve anything. It would only prolong the pain. Determined to make amends, Karen threw herself into fulfilling the terms of her sentence. Her community service assignment placed her at a local shelter for homeless veterans, where she spent hours serving meals, organizing donations, and listening to stories from people who had faced hardships far greater than hers. At first, she worried they would judge her too, but instead, many welcomed her warmly. One veteran, an older man named George, took a particular liking to her. He often sat beside her during mealtimes, sharing tales of his time in the military and offering words of encouragement. "You're not defined by your worst moment," he told her one afternoon, his voice steady and kind. "What matters is what you do next." Those simple words stuck with Karen, becoming a mantra she repeated to herself on tough days. Slowly, she began to see her situation differently, not as a punishment she deserved to endure, but as an opportunity to grow and give back. The counseling sessions were harder. Sitting across from a therapist, Karen was forced to confront parts of herself she'd rather ignore. Her impulsiveness, her tendency to seek attention, her habit of brushing off consequences. At times, the process felt excruciating, like peeling back layers of skin to expose raw nerves beneath. But it also helped her understand why she had acted the way she did, and more importantly, how to avoid repeating those mistakes. Her counselor encouraged her to write letters of apology, not just to the royal guards and authorities involved, but to herself. Writing allowed her to process her emotions and take ownership of her actions without letting guilt consume her entirely. As months passed, Karen started speaking publicly about her experience. She reached out to schools and community groups, offering to share her story as a lesson in accountability and thoughtfulness. Standing in front of audiences wasn't easy. Her hands trembled, and her voice sometimes cracked, but she pushed through the discomfort because she believed it mattered. She talked about the thrill of travel, the allure of adventure, and the importance of respecting boundaries, even when they seemed invisible. She admitted her own failures openly, hoping others might learn from them. To her surprise, people responded positively. Teachers thanked her for addressing topics like impulse control and cultural sensitivity with honesty. Students asked thoughtful questions, curious about how someone so ordinary could end up in such extraordinary circumstances. Karen realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a bridge connecting her to others. By owning her mistakes, she inspired conversations about forgiveness, growth, and second chances. Her efforts didn't erase the past, nor did they silence all her critics. Some still viewed her as reckless or entitled, and online comments occasionally reminded her of the damage she'd caused. But Karen learned to focus on what she could control: her attitude, her actions, and her willingness to keep moving forward. Over time, the negativity faded into the background, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild her life piece by piece. One evening, as Karen sat alone in her apartment, she pulled out a notebook and began writing. She jotted down lessons she'd learned along the way. Think before you act. Respect traditions, even if you don't fully understand them. Mistakes are part of being human, but growth is a choice. Each phrase felt like a step toward healing, a reminder that she was no longer the same person who had stood outside Buckingham Palace that fateful day. Looking back, Karen knew she couldn't undo what had happened. But she also knew something else. She wasn't defined by her worst moment. What mattered now was how. Years had passed since the Buckingham Palace incident, but its lessons stayed with Karen like an indelible mark on her soul. Life had moved forward, and so had she. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. The scars of that day weren't visible on her skin, but they were etched into her heart, shaping the person she had become. She no longer craved reckless adventures or sought attention through impulsive stunts. Instead, she found joy in quieter moments, volunteering at the shelter, mentoring young travelers about cultural sensitivity, and exploring new places with a newfound respect for boundaries and traditions. One crisp autumn morning, Karen decided it was time to return to London, not as a careless tourist, but as someone who understood the weight of her past actions. She packed lightly, bringing only essentials, along with a journal where she planned to document her reflections. As the plane descended into Heathrow Airport, her stomach fluttered with nerves. Would people recognize her? Would they judge her? Part of her wanted to turn back, but another part, the stronger, wiser part, knew this trip was necessary. It wasn't just about revisiting the city, it was about closure. Walking through the streets of London felt surreal. The familiar sights, the red double-decker buses, the historic buildings, the bustling markets, brought back memories both good and bad. Karen took her time, soaking in the atmosphere without rushing. But there was one place she couldn't avoid forever: Buckingham Palace. On her final day in the city, she made her way there, her steps hesitant but deliberate. The golden gates loomed ahead, gleaming under the pale sunlight, and for a moment she froze. Her mind flashed back to that chaotic afternoon. The laughter, the gasps, the shouts, the fear. She closed her eyes, steadying herself before stepping closer. This time, Karen kept her distance. She joined the crowd gathered near the palace courtyard, blending in seamlessly among tourists, snapping photos and marveling at the changing of the guard ceremony. The guards stood tall and stoic, their rifles resting against their shoulders, just as they always had. To Karen, they no longer seemed like props or statues. They were symbols of duty, discipline, and history. Watching them march in perfect formation, she felt a pang of guilt mixed with admiration. These men and women weren't performers, they were protectors, carrying responsibilities far greater than she had ever imagined. As the band played lively tunes and the soldiers executed precise movements, Karen's eyes welled up with tears. She didn't cry out of self-pity or regret, though. This time, her tears came from gratitude, for the chance to witness the ceremony again, for the opportunity to reflect on how far she'd come, and for the reminder that second chances were possible if you worked hard enough for them. Standing there, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her name or her story, she felt a profound sense of peace. After the ceremony ended, Karen lingered for a while longer, taking in every detail. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked away, leaving Buckingham Palace behind once more. This time, however, she didn't look back. Her journey wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and moving forward with purpose. On the flight home, Karen opened her journal and began writing. Today, she wrote, I faced my biggest mistake head-on, not because I wanted to prove anything to anyone, but because I needed to prove something to myself. I am not the same person I was years ago. I've grown, I've changed, and I've learned. And while I can't change what happened, I can choose how to live the rest of my life, with humility, gratitude, and respect. When she returned home, Karen continued sharing her story, speaking at events and writing articles about personal growth and accountability. Her message resonated with people from all walks of life, reminding them that everyone makes mistakes, but it's how we respond to those mistakes that truly defines us. Over time, Karen stopped seeing herself as a cautionary tale. Instead, she embraced her role as a beacon of hope, proof that even the most embarrassing failures could lead to meaningful transformation. And so, Karen's story came full circle, not with fame or fortune, but with quiet redemption. She still loved traveling, still sought adventure, and still marveled at the beauty of the world. But now, she did it all with a deeper understanding of responsibility and respect. What had started as a harmless prank gone horribly wrong had become a powerful lesson in resilience, forgiveness, and the endless capacity for change. For Karen, that was worth more than any trophy or rifle could ever be.